I'm going to start things off just with a little housekeeping notes. The documents in front of you are mostly stuff the presenters will be going over. The blue sheet is a survey form we use to track how successful these programs are and how useful they are to you as our clients and customers. So if you could either fill those out and return them to the girls sitting out front at the table when you leave, that would be really appreciated. The panel to my right is all Mercatus scholars and staff. And Eileen Norcross, here in the middle, is a senior research fellow with the Social Change Project and the lead researcher on the State and Local Policy Project. Her work focuses on the questions of how societies sustain prosperity and the role civil society plays in supporting economic resiliency. Her areas of research include fiscal federalism in institutions, state and local governments, and economic development. She has testified before Congress on a variety of topics, including the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is a mouthful, and the use of technology to monitor stimulus funding. She blogs on state and local issues at Mercatus' Neighborhood Effects blog. A native of New Jersey, Ms. Norcross graduated summa cum laude from Rutgers and earned her master's in economics from Rutgers in 1996. Matthew Mitchell, down at the far end, is a research fellow with the State and Local Policy Project, focusing on spending and budget issues, particularly the ways in which government policy is developed and how it implements various measures of well-being. Matthew received his PhD in economics from George Mason University and a political science and economics degrees from Arizona State University. Daniel Rothschild is the managing director of the Mercatus Center's State and Local Policy Project, where he coordinates Mercatus research on state and local economic policy, and he also directs the Gulf Coast Recovery Project. His articles and reviews have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, Reason, Slate, Chicago Policy Review, the Michigan Journal of Public Affairs, and Economic Affairs. He has testified and consulted with policymakers in several states before Congress and internationally, discussing Mercatus' research and its applications to current policy debates. So to introduce today's topics on fiscal federalism, Dan Rothschild.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Aaron. So as Aaron said, the topic that we're here to talk about today is fiscal federalism. And broadly, what that means is the relationship between federal spending and state spending, how financial and fiscal transfers occur between them, and the ramifications of one set of policy choices on another. Understanding the relationship between the way that states and the federal government's budget is something that's increasingly important, if for no other reason than federal aid to state and local governments increased by 73% between 2000 and 2009. So that's before the financial meltdown and before the stimulus package. We've seen this massive explosion in the federal government executing federal policy goals through state governments by sending state governments money. And we need to have more research and more discussion about what the ramifications are of this. This year, federal aid to state and local governments will hit a total of $439 billion. To give you a sense of what that is in terms of orders of magnitude, that's about 10 times the Department of Homeland Security's annual budget. So this is a massive amount of money that we're spending on the federal level with, as of yet, unclear effects on states in the long term. Now, as most of you know, when federal aid goes to the states, it is, in the majority of cases, encumbered. So it's not something that state governments and state policymakers can take and do whatever they wish with. It usually comes with strings attached, or it's earmarked for particular purposes like education, Medicare, Medicaid. And the effects of these encumbrances can either be desirable or undesirable. Now, the problem facing states right now, as most of you know, is that since 2009, tax revenues that states have collected have been declining. So the federal government's been kicking in through a variety of mechanisms to increase the ability of states to continue to spend. But it looks like tax revenues are likely to decline for at least a couple more years on the state level through 2012. In fiscal year 2011, states face a combined $89 billion deficit, and even though all states except, I believe, California have patched them this year, they're still looking to next year when tax revenues are likely to be down yet again. But it's important to note that this is not an overnight phenomenon. This is not the result of decisions that have been made over the last 1, 2, 3, 4 years. This is something that's been in the making for several decades, and it's only the fact that revenue decreases have occurred over the last couple of years that we've begun to really see what this means on the state level. So this is something that the United States has been walking into for a long time, and it's high time that we better understand the relationship between federal and state spending and transfers from the federal government to the state government. So basically where this leaves us is that it's not entirely clear what we can do to maintain the essential services that states provide while at the same time maintaining a meaningful sense of federalism. So what we're hoping to do here today is have a conversation about what the ramifications are of federal aid to the states, both good and bad, and what the policy implications are in Congress as well as in state capitals. Now, these questions of the relationships between federal and state governments are core of what the State and Local Policy Project at the Mercatus Center researches. And Eileen and Matt, two of our key researchers on the State and Local Policy Project, will be able to delve into this in some depth. They're going to be discussing what their research means and what its implications are for the decisions that the Congress makes every year with regards to budgeting. Specifically, Eileen will be discussing the fact that all states ostensibly have balanced budgets. 49 of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements. But she'll be looking at to what extent these states truly have balanced budgets and to what extent their long-term financial and fiscal financial and fiscal obligations mean that their budgets are somewhat less than balanced. Matt will be discussing the drivers behind the state budget crisis, what states can do, and what Congress needs to know about these transfers. He'll be discussing specifically his new research on what accounts for some of the variation in the gaps between states with relatively high budget deficits and states with relatively low budget deficits. So before I turn things over to Eileen, I'll just leave you with 3 economic terms of art to bear in mind that I think will help cast a lot of light on some of the specifics of what they're talking about. The first term is, and please excuse me if you're familiar with these terms, but the first is fungibility. So fungible goods are those that can be substituted for one another. So in this context, what we would mean would be that, for example, $1 coming from the federal government to the states for education and $1 from states' general funds can be said, for the purposes of education, to be fungible, so they can be swapped out one for another. The second is the concept of opportunity cost, and I'll quote David Henderson's definition here from the Library of Economics and Liberty. Opportunity cost is, quote, the value of the next highest valued alternative use of a resource. If, for example, you spend time and money going to a movie, you cannot spend that time at home reading a book, and you cannot spend the money on something else, end quote. So in other words, if we're spending money on one thing, we can't have the benefit that would be accrued from spending the money on a different program. And the third concept, and Eileen will talk about this, is the concept of soft budget constraints. Chion and Rowland, in their December 1998 AER, American Economic Review article, say that unlike hard constraints, which are inviolable, soft constraints exist, quote, when an enterprise or any organization expects to be bailed out in case of financial trouble, end quote. So I think the concepts of fungibility, opportunity cost, and soft constraints go to a lot of the research that Matt and Eileen are doing. I hope that what we can have today is a conversation. They'll each present for a few minutes. Then we'll have some time for some back and forth. I'll let the two of them comment on one another's research to the extent that that's helpful. And then we'll open the floor for questions as quickly as possible. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Eileen.
Thank you, Dan, for that great introduction, and thank you for coming today to this discussion about something very interesting and also pressing, which is the question of whether the stimulus is actually helping the states to fill in their budget gaps, or is it deepening the budget gaps and making these problems worse. And I'm going to talk about one state in particular today, which I've been looking at recently, which is Maryland. This is the second state I've sort of taken an in-depth case study approach to unraveling their budgets to see what's been going on over a period of years. But first, some background. State budget gaps, as Dan just mentioned, have been deepening and present since 2009. They've totaled, between that period, $300 billion. Revenues are not anticipated to recover. In some cases, projections are that they won't recover until 2015. And the stimulus is evaporating this year and into next year. So talking about Maryland, the question is, the conventional wisdom is that states were going along very nicely until the financial crash, and then there was this huge drop in revenues, and suddenly they couldn't balance their budgets. In fact, many states have been experiencing mounting fiscal problems for at least a decade. And in the case of Maryland, here's a picture of their ongoing structural deficit. And the structural deficit is the difference between the revenues that they're collecting on the state level through state taxation and the spending they're undertaking in their general fund. And there's been a growing and widening gap since 2007 between what they've been collecting and what they've been spending. there are some reasons for this, and we can see the signs of this going back over decades. Of course, states have known for years that Medicaid was an ongoing problem, and you can go back and look at the literature in the 1980s and states warning that the growing cost of Medicaid is going to start crowding out more and more of their budgets, and they're going to have to raise more in taxes to support it. In the case of Maryland, Medicaid spending has increased 223% since 1998. And then in 2003, the state passed a major education bill to supplement education spending called the Thornton Bridge to Excellence Act. So this is a state mandate that's now part of Maryland's budget that they knew full well was going to raise costs very dramatically in the short run, and that in fact did increase costs by 144% in terms of what they now have to pay to the local government to implement this program. So these are two of the drivers in Maryland's budget that are sort of embedded in the budget. These are cost drivers, and they're not going away. They're only going to increase in cost. So in order to address the budget gaps that have appeared, we find in state budgets they've been sort of scrambling to do any number of things. And I'm just going to focus on Maryland, but recently I've put out a paper called Fiscal Evasion, which looks a bit at all of the tactics that states have been engaging in to fill these holes. And when you start assessing these maneuvers, you realize it's kind of like a panic-type maneuvers that they're engaging in, issuing more debt, dumping special funds, and other kinds of gimmicks that essentially are one-time fixes, because once you dump that special fund, it's not going to be there next year necessarily. So in the case of Maryland, it's really fascinating to me the number of times they've dumped money from earmarked funds into the general fund to balance the budget. So Maryland has a lot of special funds, and these special funds are things that you issue, you have a fee or a special tax for to pay for earmarked spending. And these funds are supposed to be dedicated to a particular use. Recently, what the state's been doing is sort of raiding these funds in order to fill in that budget gap, and then replacing those raided funds with bonds. So it's issuing more debt to replace the special funds that they're using to balance the budget. And that's kind of like a warning signal. You're like shaking the piggy bank, try to figure out where you're going to get the money from to pay for current spending. So as I mentioned, they've been increasing debt to fill their budget gaps, and then they've been relying on the stimulus. And Maryland recently has instituted a video lottery. So you see in a lot of the states these kind of, rush to sin taxes and other revenue sources to just sort of fill in these budget gaps as best they can. And what I found really remarkable about Maryland's budget is when you read budgets, you find that the way that the narrative goes is to say, we're making really, really tough choices, we're really having to cut. And they talk about these cuts like, it's been really tough. But in fact, all of those cuts have been replaced by the stimulus, and the stimulus is way in excess of what they've cut. So this table shows you the cuts that were undertaken between 2008 and 2010, and then how they were replaced with the stimulus. And in fact, in the budgetary language, they say, well, we cut this, and then that was funded by the stimulus. And not only was it funded by the stimulus, they spent beyond what they cut. And I think this is probably the most interesting signal of all. You probably know 29 states balanced their budgets on the expectation that the federal government would extend the stimulus FMAP provision for another half year. And Maryland did the same thing. So they presented a balanced budget, and they said we balanced it on the expectation that we're going to get $389 million to authorize to support Medicaid. So the question then is, what is the stimulus going towards? It's going towards sustaining spending that can't be sustained absent more stimulus, because these are cost drivers. They're going to be there next year. They're going to be there in 2014. So the stimulus at work in Maryland, they received $879 million in fiscal stabilization funds. According to the stimulus requirements, 81.8% of that is supposed to be spent to restore education cuts that states were making. However, in the case of Maryland, they'd already increased spending in education because of the Thornton Bridge to Excellence Act, so that didn't apply. What Maryland was able to do was to use that money for other uses, and we just talked about fungibility. So they're using it to enhance employee fringe benefits. And then the other 18% of the stimulus is for general government and for things like police salaries. Then there were additional funds that the stimulus awarded, and these were meant to stimulate the economy, the shovel-ready aspect of the stimulus. So that's $320 million in the case of Maryland for energy efficiency projects, nutritional assistance. Then you have other smaller grants for the arts and for law enforcement and habitat conservation. So the question of how did Maryland close the gap, and this is what I was getting at before, the transfers, the other revenue sources, the reductions. In the case of Maryland, these are the sort of gimmicks they're using to close the budget gap, not the stimulus, this is without the stimulus. So transfers, they've been relying much more steadily on this, and then they're replacing those transfers with more bond issues. So they're sort of indirectly using bonds to balance their budget. And many other states, they're directly using bonding to balance their budgets. So to characterize some of these transfers, they transferred $173 million from a state retiree health benefit account. This is sort of a variation on the pension deferral. They're taking money out of things that they know they're going to have to pay for in the future that people are banking on for public sector health benefits, and they're using that to balance the budget. So it's not very much different from deferring your pension payment, which many states have done to balance the budget, even though you're going to have to pay that plus some the next year. They have dedicated $300 million from their highway users fund, and they've permanently transferred that to the general fund. And those $882 million in transfers are now being replaced with debt. So when you look at Maryland's budget, you find that their state taxation has fallen. So the portion of their budget that's funded with state taxation is falling. But their federal funds have experienced double-digit growth. So that's what's supporting their budget. The largest growth is in entitlement funds. Medicaid's grown by 31.9%, and general funds have fallen, except as I showed before, those funds are being replaced with stimulus dollars. So it kind of suggests a paradox that many states, as Dan noted, have operated for years under tax and expenditure limitations and rules that sound like they should be encouraging fiscal prudence in terms of how fast budgets grow. Balanced budget requirements would seem to indicate that if a state is presenting a balanced budget, that everything's fine. They've found the money to pay for spending. Yet that's not what's going on. It suggests a kind of paradox. So the key to understanding state budgets is to ask, what does the rule say? Is it a good rule? And then if it seems like a good rule that's going to encourage fiscal discipline, is it honored or is it evaded? And in Maryland, I would suggest they have one of the worst spending rules one can imagine, which is to tie spending growth to income growth. So every year they've basically built spending into their budget. As state income grew, they simply kept spending at the same rate of growth. And it seems logical on its face. You know, well, we're going to spend in good years, and then when income falls, we'll just cut spending. Except it's very difficult to cut, especially when you spend on creating mandated programs that you know you're going to have to continue funding at a certain level. It just means that when there is a revenue contraction, you're going to have to find that money. So this is a long-term picture between 1979 and 2011, and you can see the difference. And what's interesting about what's going on in the states is how states responded to the recession in 1991 versus the 2003 recession, 2001, 2002, and the current recession. In 1990-91, states cut. In 2002, the states did. In 2003, they received a small, something like a stimulus. The Bush administration did award bailout funds to the states in that period. And you can see the effect is somewhat the same. Spending was not really cut. It just ended up subsidizing the problem for a little while longer. Another interesting feature of Maryland's budget is that they have a relatively strict limit on debt, and they seem to honor it. So, and they haven't really taken on more debt than the limit requires them to take on or limits them to. But what they've done is they've sort of gone to the maximum, and they've built a lot of debt into their budget. So now you can see that they have a lot of tax-supported debt that's growing, and debt service that is starting to grow as well. This is a sort of a long-term picture of the role of the federal government in awarding money to the states, and you can see that general trend up, and of course it's gotten very high recently. And that gets to the question of, what is the effect of federal spending in the states? And there are a few behavioral changes that occur. First, we talked about softening the budget constraint. One feature of a federalist system is the presence of a hard budget constraint, and what that means is that the higher level of government does not bail out the lower level of government when it faces fiscal difficulties. And the reason for that is that those fiscal difficulties could be because of poor choices on the part of that lower level of government, and to bail them out is actually to encourage that behavior. It can stimulate greater state-level spending when you give a grant to a lower level of government. It actually might encourage them to grow spending beyond what they normally would have undertaken for that project. It may encourage them to spend on things that they don't necessarily need or want. It can stimulate greater bonding to support the federal spending. It can stimulate greater taxation to support the federally initiated spending, and thus raise overall indebtedness both on the state and the federal level. And that's my last slide, and I'll just conclude with that. And I'm happy to take your questions, but I think Matt will talk to us more now about budget rules and their effects.
Let me switch the presentation here. Thanks, Eileen. So I'm going to talk a little bit bigger picture here, and start with sort of a broad concept called economic freedom, and then relate that to the state budgets and then the recent state budget gaps. So begin with a couple pictures here. When you were an economist, I'm sure none of you have this problem, but when you're an economist, you often end up making excuses or apologizing for the boringness of your profession. So this especially happens if you're fortunate like me to marry into this family that has all these cool professions, jet fighter pilots and firemen and doctors. So what I usually like to do is start out a talk by saying, wait a second, economics actually is very important. It's powerful because it has to do with almost every aspect of your life, and it really is a determination of, makes the difference between poverty and prosperity. So here are two pictures. The top one, which is not coming in perfectly well, but is Caracas, Venezuela. And it's a slum outside of Caracas, Venezuela. The bottom one is Santiago, Chile. So here are two countries in Latin America that are respectively the poorest and the wealthiest in Latin America. I would submit that the difference between these different levels of prosperity really has very little to do with the people. Chileans are no more hardworking, are no more dedicated, are no more intelligent than Venezuelans. I would say it doesn't have much to do with the natural resources. It doesn't have much to do with the history. It has a lot to do with the institutions, and the institutions of these two countries are very, very different. Chile is widely regarded as one of the most economically free countries in Latin America, and Venezuela one of the least economically free. So what is economic freedom? It's an idea that really is nothing new. It goes back to at least the time of Adam Smith. He wrote that all that is necessary to carry a nation from the lowest level of barbarism to the highest level of opulence are peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. So for hundreds of years, economists have been writing about this, but for a long time, we lacked really an ability to say something quantitatively about it. We could just say, we think freedom matters, but there was really nothing else you could say. Well, there was a project that began really in the 1990s and has since taken off in a number of organizations that has started to measure economic freedom. Here's one example of it. This is an index put out by the Fraser Institute with professors from Florida State and Capita University. What they do is they go around to each of the countries in the world and they measure their levels of economic freedom using objective standards. So they look at the size of government, how much does government tax, how much consumption, how much of the GDP does the government consume, what are its marginal tax rates, things like that. They look at regulation, how easy is it to start a business? They look at what sorts of prices are controlled by government, including interest rates, minimum wage laws, things like that. They look at sound money. How valid is government's promise to keep the value of the currency that it issues? I have in my wallet a $100 trillion note from Zimbabwe. So this is an example of a country that has broken its promise to maintain a stable currency. They look at free trade. How easy is it to exchange goods with people who happen to live in another country? When you try to exchange goods, do you encounter high tariffs, quotas, Is there a lot of subsidies for the local producers? And then finally, they look at the rule of law. So how independent are judges, and is private property well protected and contracts enforced? So they look at these things and they put together an index and score each country based on its level of economic freedom. At the state level, a number of organizations have done the same. They don't worry as much about monetary policy as other countries are or free trade as they do at the national level, but they still look at size of government regulation and rule of law. Fraser Institute also puts out one of these. The Mercatus Center actually has just recently started putting out one of the more comprehensive measures of economic freedom at the state level. So what's the value of economic freedom? Well, it turns out it's extremely powerful. This isn't really showing up particularly well, unfortunately. But along the horizontal axis is the economic freedom of all the countries in the world. Going from 3 to 9, no country is less free than 3, and no country is more free than 9, according to this Fraser Index. And then on the vertical axis is per capita GDP. It's adjusted for purchasing power parity, so cost of living across countries. So you can see, and each of these little dots represents a country, and there's a line that connects them. As you can see, economic freedom is highly correlated with human prosperity. It's one of the best predictors of greater prosperity on an individual level. Those countries that have more freedom tend to have greater levels of prosperity. So you can see some of the countries, in the top area: Norway, Singapore, United States, Ireland, Hong Kong, all countries that are relatively free, all countries that have relatively high GDP. This is the Fraser Index, but there are other indices. Heritage and other organizations come out with the same thing, and they've been shown to have the same effect. This is just a picture of it. Hundreds of peer-reviewed articles in academic journals have looked at the statistical relationship and found that it's a very, very strong predictor of economic prosperity. To put it in perspective, one way you can think about it is divide the countries into quartiles. In the least free quartile, the average per capita GDP is about 3,800 in the least free, but in the most free, it's about 37,000. So it makes a big difference. It's nearly 9 times, or it's more than 9 times the difference, right? So it's not all about money. It's not all about resources. It also has to do with a lot of the important things that humans seem to value: life expectancy, environmental performance, population with clean water, corruption, GDP per capita of the poorest 10%. You look at all these measures that humans seem to care about, and economic freedom is positively related to them. So it doesn't just make countries wealthier, it also makes them better on a number of really important dimensions. What about the things people don't like? We don't like unemployment. We don't like children in the labor force. We don't like infant mortality. All of these things are negatively related to economic freedom. So it's positively related to the good things and negatively related to the bad things. It's an extremely powerful way to make the world a better place. So that's my little pitch for why economics is just as cool as being a fighter pilot. But so what does this mean at the state level? Well, size of government is, as I said, an important component of economic freedom. Where is that going? Well, one way to look at this is to compare, and you have one of these graphs in your handouts, is to compare the growth in the private sector over time with growth in the public sector over time. So this blue line that's barely showing up, unfortunately, is real private GDP. And this is real, so it's adjusted for inflation. And what this is it's a multiple of the base year. So every dot along this line represents how many times it is larger than it was back in 1950. So at the end, in 2009, we see that real private GDP is about 5 times what it was in 1950. So this is good. The economy is growing. But at the same time, real state and local expenditures, this is consumption and gross investment. This is basically the component of government, state and local government that makes its way into GDP. It's nearly 10 times. So what we're doing at the state and local level is constantly, year in, year out, outpacing the private sector's ability to create wealth. Government doesn't sell anything. It doesn't create any products. All of its resources are taxed or borrowed out of the private economy. And you can't, on a continual basis, outpace the wealth-creating sectors of the economy, or it just won't work. It's unsustainable, right? So to put this in perspective, we could look at more recent time periods. Look at it in different time periods. So from 2008 to 2009, every $1 that was added to the private sector, 1.2 was added to the state and local government spending. So it's outpacing the private sector by 1 to 1.2. Well, how about a more recent time frame? Look at 1995. Well, from there, it's 1 to 1.4. And in the most recent, from 2000 to 2009, the private sector was outpaced by nearly twice as much. So state and local governments are spending nearly twice the clip of the private sector. By the way, as an aside, I'd note the federal government actually from 2000 to 2009 grew much faster. For most of this time period, the state and local governments grew faster than the federal government. That reversed in the 2000s, and the federal government grew nearly 4 times as fast as the private sector. It's huge. Again, it's unsustainable. Well, what are the factors that are causing this? So one way to do this is to look at each of the components of state spending. So there's elementary and secondary education, higher education, transportation, Medicaid, cash assistance, corrections, total, and then others. And then you can stack inflation and population rates to see how all these components are growing on a real basis. So on a real per capita basis, is government spending more on these components? Well, you can see government is spending more on a real per capita basis on most of these components. But the huge factor up here is Medicaid. It's outpacing the growth of other spending by nearly twice as much. This has, I also look at it in one of the papers, we look at medical care inflation, and that explains some of it, because medical care inflation is greater than general inflation, but it really doesn't explain the whole thing. That only explains about half of it. Enrollment growth in Medicaid is a huge, huge factor. So what about the budget gaps? Eileen mentioned the total budget gaps from 2009 to through 2012. I think, what did you say was 300 billion? Is that right? 300 billion. So in 2009 alone, it was 109 billion. In 2010, it was 200 billion. It's a huge budget gaps. And all states but Vermont have some sort of an obligation to balance their budget gaps. But the question is how they do it. And there's been a lot of pain, and states have laid off workers, furloughed, raised taxes. In some cases, Illinois, they've just stopped paying vendors. So if you sell to the federal government, you may not get paid. What's that? State government. I'm sorry, state government. Yes, thank you. Same thing in California. Some vendors have just not been paid for long periods of time. So it's been pretty nasty. So the question is, what do? Do you raise taxes or do you cut spending? Well, one hypothesis shed some light on this. It's called the tax spend hypothesis. Developed a long time ago, actually by Milton Friedman in the 1970s, but since then it's been empirically studied a number of times. And the hypothesis here is that government spending will adjust to whatever revenue is available. Okay? So if you raise revenue, spending will just adjust to it. So people have looked at this, and a number of studies have found, actually, that there is very strong evidence for the tax spend hypothesis at the state level. If we have more time, we can talk about it at the national level, where it's not as strong of evidence. But so here's what one researcher put it. Any policy to reduce budget deficits via revenue may not result in deficit reduction. The point is, you raise taxes in order to cut the budget deficit, but you wait a couple of years later and they look, spending almost always adjusts right back up. So this suggests, I would say, that raising revenue either through federal grants to the states or through tax increases is really not going to get rid of the budget deficit problem in the long run. So one of the things I wanted to do was look at what is it that caused these budget deficits in the first place, these budget gaps. So I gathered data on all the states and the size of their 2009 and 2010 budget gaps, and looked at a number of policies leading up to these budget gaps. What was different in these states preceding them? So I looked at spending as a share of the state income. So how big was the state spending footprint? I looked at per capita spending growth, how quickly had spending grown in the decades preceding the budget gaps. I looked at the presence of strict balanced budget requirements. So a little background here. As we said, every state but Vermont has a balanced budget requirement, but these differ. Some states only have to have a proposed balanced budget. Other states actually, after the fact, after the governor has signed it and the legislature has passed it, it has to be balanced in fact. Some states can roll over a budget deficit from year to year. Others can't. And then finally, some states are judged on the degree to which their budgets are balanced by independently elected judges versus appointed judges. So that makes a big difference, and a number of researchers have examined whether the presence of a strict balanced budget makes for fewer budget gaps in the first place. So it's sort of like knowing, okay, down the road we really have to comply with this rule. Let's see if we can get our fiscal house in order up front. And then finally, I looked at economic freedom using the Mercatus measure. So what did I find? Well, the first finding is that those states that have spent a lot as a share of their of their state budgets and have spent a lot for decades actually tended to have smaller budget gaps. So it may be that they're able to sort of adjust to a bigger government and make revenues and expenditures meet up, or it may be that those states that happen to have low volatility in their revenue sources. Maybe they have higher natural resources or things like that that mean that they don't have real volatile revenue. Those states may be able to grow large and also balance their budgets easier. But this really shouldn't be a lot of solace for a state legislator who thinks he's going to close his budget gap, or she is going to close their budget gap by raising taxes. The reason is that this has to happen for decades. The other finding was to look at what is per capita spending growth. So if you look at each of the states and how their per capita spending has grown in the decades preceding the budget gap, it turns out that leads those states that had spent the most tended to have larger budget gaps. So those states that per capita spending levels grew the most, had larger budget gaps. So we'll put this in one perspective. One standard deviation slower growth in per capita spending leads to a budget gap that's about 25% smaller. So it's a big difference. Any questions about that? We can get into the questions at the end. But the strict balanced budget requirements. Those states that have these strict stringencies that at the end of the day, they know they have to balance their budgets. How does that impact the budget gap in the first place? Well, it turns out that those states with strict balanced budget requirements actually have 30 to 40% smaller budget gaps in the first place. So it makes a big difference. Again, I think this probably is as important as much for federal aid to states as it is for thinking about federal reform. Some of these policies may be, the states are sort of laboratories, and they may point in a positive direction for federal reforms as well. And then finally, economic freedom. Well, it turns out that those states that enjoy greater levels of economic freedom, which, as I said earlier, is associated with all sorts of positive things, from higher income to lower infant mortality and things like that, well, it turns out it also is associated with smaller budget gaps. So those states with one standard deviation greater economic freedom experience 30% smaller budget gaps. So in sum, I read this as strong evidence that slower state spending growth, strict balanced budget requirements, and greater economic freedom are all associated with much smaller budget gaps and fiscal balance. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is you face a budget gap and you raise taxes, or you get funding for the federal government. And due to the tax spend hypothesis, that just cycles back into greater spending growth. And then, according to my analysis, those states that spend the most, remember, have larger budget gaps in the long run. So it ends up in this vicious cycle that even if you're a fan of robust government and you want a progressive, active government solving problems, this is not really a helpful scenario, because you constantly run into this boom and bust cycle in budgeting. So I would argue for an alternative, which is balance and lower greater economic freedom. Here's one way to look at it is look at spending restraint. So in a recent paper that's going to come out, I think today actually, I mapped out for several states their actual spending patterns, and then what that spending would be if they had held spending to real inflation-adjusted per capita level. So if, say, starting in 1995, the typical state had said, okay, we're just going to not allow we're only going to allow spending to grow at the rate of inflation plus population growth. And another way to say this is it's going to allow spending to remain fixed on a real basis, real individual basis. And then I estimated spending under such a scenario, presuming that there would be some periods in which spending would decline naturally. Well, it turns out that I looked at 14 states, the 10 with the worst budget gaps in 2009 and the 10 with the worst budget gaps in 2010. There was some states that made both lists, so it ended up being 14 states. Well, it turns out 12 of the 14 would have had zero budget gap in 2009 if they had kept spending at inflation plus population growth since 1995. 12 of the 14. 13 of the 14 states would have had no budget gap if they had done this at 1987 levels. So this isn't a real far distant past. This is not a time when state governments were, really, really cut to the bone. This is relatively recent. And just going back to those budget levels would have taken care of the entire budget gap. So what are things that states can do in order to achieve greater fiscal balance and smaller budget gaps? Well, it turns out there's a number of things. One are tax and expenditure limitations, but the the key here is that they need to be the right kind. So most states actually have these, but they do not operate the same way. As Eileen said, Maryland has a tax and expenditure limitation that allows state budgeting, the state budget to grow with the rate of income. Other states have more restrictive tax and expenditure limitations, which say budgeting can only grow at the rate of inflation plus population growth. That's much more restrictive. There's also different combinations where states will automatically refund surpluses to the taxpayers, which provides an incentive to keep this project, keep the institution in place. Those tend to be much more effective. And there's also differences where limitation automatically adjusts. So those make a difference, but the details matter. Executive reduction in a lower amount. It turns out that has a statistically significant, research has found that tends to be associated with smaller budgets and smaller budget gaps. Strict balanced budget requirements, though they're designed just to keep a budget in balance, they actually limit overall spending. So it has two benefits. And then finally, a supermajority vote for tax increases. So several legislators require, several governments require their state legislatures to have supermajority requirements if they're going to raise taxes. I think it's about 15 states. So that makes a big difference and lowers the typical size of the balance of the budget gap and also overall spending. So with that, I'll close out, and I'm happy to take any questions along with Eileen.
Thanks, Matt. I'll kick it off with just a couple of questions. First, Eileen, a lot of what you were focusing on looked at Maryland. Now, Maryland is not one of the states that's like California, New Jersey, New York that has one of the highest levels of budget deficit as a percentage of their last balanced budget. So to what extent is Maryland typical of other states, and to what extent is it atypical?
You're right. In terms of the size of its budget gap, it's actually towards the bottom. I would describe it as typical only in the strategies that it's using to close its budget gap, and that's what concerns me with all of the states, is this sort of reliance on mechanisms that will actually cause them to have future problems. So pension payment deferrals have been very popular with states. New Jersey deferred their pension payment again this year. Virginia did. Virginia's not in bad shape per se, but these are the tactics they use that end up causing them future problems. So then in the future, they've got much larger pension payments that they need to make into the pension system.
And I'll throw this question out to both of you. I think both of you have done a really good job of painting an idea of the situation that the states are in, how they got there, and the fact that this is not the fault of a couple of years of poor decision making by states or by the federal government or anything else. This is something that both the states and federal government have been holding hands on for 30 years as they've kind of jumped over the cliff. So what are the key takeaways that you think the federal government needs to learn in the budgeting process about how to help states maintain the kind of fiscal restraint that allows them to not slash services like we're seeing so many states do, or run up huge debts or deficits in off years?
Well, one of the things I would say is that it's really not doing states any major favors if you encourage them to build unsustainable budgets. So a lot of the programs, for instance, Medicaid, the whole funding formula is based on the idea that a state should spend beyond its means, because every dollar that the state spends, the federal government will kick in another $3 or $4. That means that the states have a real strong incentive to allocate, the marginal dollars in their budget to that one program. And as you've seen, Medicaid is the single largest driver of state budget gaps. There are other ways to fund it. If you still think this is a priority, you can do it in a way that doesn't incentivize the state budget people to spend beyond their means. You could just offer block grants, or you could have it be a completely federal program. But this funding formula really provides a lot of perverse incentives. And I would argue that it really doesn't do the states any favors. Those states that it's much worse, say for a typical state employee, to be lured into a job that's going to be have to be cut, than it is to just build a sustainable budget growth over the long time. I think that's better for basically all sides.
Eileen, you've looked a lot at block grant programs, especially the community development block grant, and also at state pension issues and states off-books obligations. Do you have anything to add to what Matt was saying?
I would just wanted to add that in addition to using those marginal dollars, of course, there have been many investigations into the Medicaid program and how it's encouraged fraud and the use of sort of a money laundering tactic on the part of the states to increase the amount of money the federal government will award to the states. So there's that gamesmanship aspect. And I'm sorry, you wanted me to speak to pensions and...
No, that's okay.
Okay. And in terms of, I'm sorry, the community development block grant, one feature of grants that I don't think we discussed too much yet is the idea of a flypaper effect. And that's a phenomenon in the literature that says when you give a grant, when a higher level of government awards a grant to a lower level of government, it will stimulate spending beyond the amount of the grant. So it encourages, if you're giving a locality $1, them to spend $1.05 because they take on more in that project. Or it might encourage them to undertake a project that will need future financing. So back in the 60s, it was thought if you just award a grant to a lower level of government, it's just going to replace the money that they themselves don't have. It's not a one-for-one, though. And the evidence is that, in fact, it stimulates not only greater spending, but how do they finance that spending? They may start taking on debt, and you see that on the local level. They'll issue a bond to support a state or federally initiated project, and that goes on the local books as then a future obligation. And it can then stimulate an increase in taxation on the state or local level as well.
One thing about all this, too, is to sort of appreciate that the U.S. budget situation is not an accident that we tend to have a much more sound budgeting process than most nations. Recently reading in the literature here, we actually just have a very long tradition of a hard budget constraint. States know that if they spend beyond their means, they're not going to get bailed out. The precedent was set back all the way to in 1840 when there was major budget crises across the states. A bunch of states went to the federal government and asked for a bailout. The congressman, I think he was from Maryland, and his name was Cost, great name for a congressman, actually asked the federal government for a bailout. And in 1841, the federal government said no. And they've said no every year since, any time there's been any other major bailout request. So now, what's a bailout? That's one person's bailout is maybe another person's just normal business. But as I read the literature, that's, anytime the states are faced with bankruptcy, the federal government has basically said no. But we're, in the last couple decades, we're kind of easing into this. It may not be a bailout where the states are going to go bust, but it is a situation where the federal government is more and more of a backstop, and it does encourage less responsible behavior on the state level.
I would just add to that. I mean, I thought it was really remarkable that 29 states balanced their budgets, and they wrote into the budget, we expect X much from the federal government. It hadn't been appropriated. I mean, they're just saying, okay, they're going to give us more money. We know it. We feel it, And I mean, that's not the way to balance your books. At least be honest and say, well, we still have a $300 million shortfall. So that gets to the idea of changing expectations and behaviors. That when you're a recipient of grant funds over time, you're like, well, I know I'm going to get, I have a rich uncle, and they're just going to keep paying for my, my expense account.
So as I said at the beginning, we'd like this to be conversational. So what questions or comments do people in the audience have to kick things off? Do we have someone with a mic coming around?
And we got some questions about this. We have been filming the whole thing. It will be up on our website, so you can see the slides a lot more clearly than they appear here in the room. But that I will send out an email letting you all know when that's up. Probably later today, tomorrow at the latest. So
there's a question over
I'd
there.
like to be first.
I think this will be from Matt. Eileen, you may want to respond. The comparison that you showed between the state spending and the private sector spending, we have to acknowledge that for decades the state spending has been stimulating private sector growth in certain areas, infrastructure, construction, for example. So did you in your research try to differentiate that between the business-to-business growth and spending and the public sector spending that stimulated the private sector growth? So that's one question there. But another question, a different topic that came up from your beginning pictures. have either of you looked at the difference between a centralized government and a federated government as far as the budget gaps and the revenue expectations? In other words, are we dealing with federated republics where you expect a higher level of government to bail out the lower level? And what happens if it's a more centralized economy? Do you then have the lower levels of economic freedom?
That's great. A couple of great questions. So the first one is, how do you differentiate between state and local spending versus private sector growth that may be due in part to state and local spending? So the measure I'm using is by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and it's the components that make up GDP. And so what the Bureau of Economic Analysis is attempting to do in those measures is only count items once. So it's private consumption and investment, and net investment, and government consumption and net investment. And they as best as possible, try to make sure that they're not counting factors twice. So it's not like if the federal government or if the state governments buy something from the private sector, it goes into both accounts. So that's one thing. But then there's sort of I take you to be also asking sort of a macroeconomic question about how much does state spending stimulate through maybe a multiplier process or something, private sector activity. And that is actually a more controversial question than people make it out to be. There is some evidence that government can spend and stimulate the economy in the short run, but the estimates here are very, very, very wide-ranging. So as you all know, I don't know if we want to turn this into a stimulus argument, but as we all know, the administration claims that every dollar the federal government spends can stimulate up to $1.68 in private sector spending. But other estimates are much, much smaller. Harvard's Robert Barrow says it's more like 30 cents to 70 cents. So it's actually if those resources were being productive in the private sector, it's actually net loss. Others have estimated, Valerie Ramy estimates it at $1.10. But one thing that's key is all these, the best case for stimulus is only during a recession when private sector resources are idle. I don't think there are any serious Keynesian, hardline Keynesian economists who claim that you can just stimulate the economy forever, even in good times. So for the most part, I don't think many people would say that regular spending year in, year out is stimulative. And then the other question was just about federalism. None of my research has looked at this, but there is some good literature out there. A number of studies have looked at countries that have federal systems versus countries that don't have federal systems. And in general, federalism is a good thing for both economic growth, smaller government, a little bit more austere and government, and better managed government. As far as I understand that literature to be saying. Person and Tabellini, I would recommend. Good. It's called Person and Tabellini. It's spelled like it's Pearson. But they have a bunch of, it's a little bit technical, but they've got a bunch of cross-country comparisons of different institutions. And then there's others who've looked at, say, the Swiss cantons and other federal systems, Australia, I think, places like that, and have tended to find that federal systems tend to be a little bit better, in part because government is competing with one another. So Arizona has to compete with New Mexico for citizenship and for tax dollars. So it has to offer better services at a lower cost. If you want to give me your contact information or email me, I'll be able to get a better, more specific links to you.
Thank you. What I'm getting from what you said, or both of you said today, is that you don't solve budget problems by giving them more money. And that increasing taxes or additional federal dollars is actually won't help in the short run and will definitely hurt in the long run. But given the fact that many of the states are laying people off and doing other things to try and fix their budgets, if you don't do either of those things, I would imagine, and this is as a layperson, a lot of these states are going to go bankrupt. So what do you have to say about that? And is that a positive from your perspective, or are you just giving facts and then let let the states figure it out.
And if I can just jump in and add a further question on that, assuming that we get through 2012 or whatever the current problem is, how can the federal government credibly commit to the states in the future to say, this is the last time, you're going to be held to a much harder budget constraint in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. It gets down to the core issue, which is how the state's been managing their finances. Certainly, what Matt speaks to is when there's more revenue, they spend more and more without considering what their real obligations are. And the great example of that is what states have committed to pay their public sector workers in their pensions. So they made a lot of commitments in the late 90s to make very generous formulas for public sector workers, and through no fault of the public sector worker, they've been made a promise. And now states are on the hook for, the Pew Center says it's $1 trillion, it's actually $3 trillion when you use the right discount rate. States are on the hook for $3 trillion worth of public pension payouts over the next 15 to 20 years. So having made that commitment, the question is, how responsible was that? Did they consider what the costs were? Did they consider how they were going to pay for that? It would seem to me they made a promise without thinking about it. And now it's the time for hard choices in the sense that they have to start asking, how are we going to pay for the things that we have obligated, that we have obligations for? There are going to have to be trade-offs. It's either, some of it's going to be higher taxation perhaps, and some of it's going to be cutting. But at the end of the day, we just can't have a sort of steady bailout of what are structural problems in state budgets. So I don't know what my menu of solutions would be other than to take a hard, honest look at how you got there, what your obligations are, and how are you going to pare down these obligations. And everything has to be on the table.
In general, I would argue for restrained spending growth over the long run. So part of the reason why I went back and did that analysis of looking at these states that had the worst budget gaps is to point out that it's so much easier to keep spending steady over the long run than it is to spend crazy and then have this big lop off. So part of my focus is kind of to turn it back on what Dan is saying is, and I don't know the answer, but is let's try to commit to restrain growth over the long run so that we're not in the same situation 10 or 15 years from now. As for what to do now, do you really allow all that suffering? I'm not an elected official, so thankfully I don't have to make that choice. But it is difficult. We've lured a lot of people into a situation where they're going to be harmed. I would say, people like Alicina from University of Chicago have looked at instances where governments have cut back, and it's actually often much quicker route to spending to economic growth if you balance budgets by cutting back, and then it's painful in a year or two, but then in a couple of years you're growing much faster than other governments that have met sort of budget problems with big tax increases.
And it's interesting, you run into these sort of case studies of in New Jersey, some employees were willing to take a pay freeze for a year, and yet the teachers' unions in that case said, no, you're not going to take a pay freeze. And these people were willing to take a pay freeze to preserve jobs for other people. So it gets down to this very complicated set of incentives that are going on inside of governments of who wants to make sure that their budget does not get cut. And you're seeing this dialogue now between different public sector unions pointing fingers at police versus teachers. So I think it's going to be a very painful period that we're going to have to go through in terms of figuring out how we're going to meet some of these obligations while ensuring that we hurt as few people as possible. So, for instance, freezing the cost of living adjustment in pension formulas will be one way, but then you get resistance from public sector unions who say that's not fair. Maybe that's not fair, but is it fair to then lay off, half of your workforce? Would you rather have less of a payment or, get rid of a percentage of your workers? So those are the kind of trade-offs that states are going to have to be looking at.
I'll throw out another question that I had for Matt. Matt, one of the recommendations that you'd made that was worth discussing was having a supermajority vote on increasing revenues and increasing tax rates. Now, the flip side of that, I think what people would argue is that's part of the reason that California is in its mess is because it's had that supermajority rule, and therefore it's basically practically impossible to raise revenues through increasing tax rates. What do you have to say to that line of thought?
That's a good question. I haven't studied California in specifics. I think Eileen may have a little bit more detail on California. My understanding of their situation is they had a pretty decent expenditure limitation in the GAN amendment, GAN limit, but it's basically changed over time and been gutted. So at that point, what you have is a supermajority requirement for tax increases, but no other sort of spending restraint, and all these other major contracts and automatic increases in the budget that really did make it a fiscal train wreck. I don't know, Eileen, are you more familiar with California's?
I'm probably as familiar as you are with it, but I've looked mainly at New Jersey and now Maryland and New York a little bit.
Good question, though, Dan.